Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
From his throne, the Dragon King asked, "What do you want for saving my daughter?" Hailebu shrugged his broad shoulders. "What more could I need except to better provide for my village?" The Dragon King showed Hailebu his 1,070 treasures, sparkling red rubies, forest green emeralds, ocean blue sapphires, and shimmery pink pearls. "I will give you anything," he said. "Your treasures are beautiful," the hunter answered, "but the only thing I desire is to understand the language of animals. Then I can be a better hunter."
Hello and welcome to Northern Lights. My name is Lisa Stuart and I work at the Minneapolis Public Library in the Youth Services Division. I'm here at the Central Library today to talk with Mary Casanova. Mary is no stranger to success. She's written a number of wonderful books for young readers, including Moose Tracks and the sequel, Wolf Shadows, and also Stealing Thunder, that have met with great critical acclaim, and also acclaim from teachers, librarians, parents, and most importantly, from children themselves. But this year, she executed a very tricky double play at the Minnesota Book Awards. She has, for the first time ever in the history of the awards, in the 2001 Minnesota Book Awards, won for two books. They were both published in 2000, and they're both, in a sense, departures from her earlier work. The first is The Hunter, which won for the Children's Prize, the best book published in Minnesota in the year 2000. And it's a retelling of a Chinese folk tale. The other book, Curse of a Winter Moon, won for the young adult division of the prize. It is set in mid-16th century France and tells the story of Marius, whose 6-year-old brother is accused of being a werewolf by the superstitious villagers in the small town. Mary, I'm wondering if first of all we could talk about The Hunter. The other books you've written were set in present day and in Minnesota. So this is a huge departure for you. I'm wondering if you can talk about the challenges of doing a retelling of a folk tale.
This folk tale, in some ways, it was a gift to me, and it was fairly easy for me to retell it because I first heard it from a Chinese exchange student who lived with us. His name was Hui. When he told me this story, I thought, I love the story. At its core, it's about making a hard decision, one that leads this hunter to sacrifice his own life for his villagers. The story moved me emotionally, and when something moves me, then I know there's a good story there, and I thought, I'll try to retell it. The harder part would be selling it. And the story did get some rejections before it was finally picked up by Simon & Schuster, who said, we only want the story if we can get Ed Young, Caldecott winning Ed Young, to illustrate this book. Well, from what I can tell, Ed Young stepped into their studios that day or the next out in New York, read this manuscript, and must have been as taken with the story at its core as I was, because he had that manuscript illustrated within the year, which is really an amazing time frame for somebody who's in such demand as he is.
Wow, and they fit so perfectly. The text and the illustrations are both so spare and yet so graceful and stylish. I feel like the story is told in very simplistic language, and yet it's such an evocative story. And the illustrations really worked well with that.
I'd like to show one of my favorite illustrations where I think that it really shows that merging of illustrations and text together. I didn't see Ed Young's work until he was basically done with it, and it's this one. As a writer, when there's a really dramatic moment, I try to focus in and slow time down and say moment by moment, what is this character really feeling? And so this is the point in the story where Hailebu, the hunter, has to decide what to do. How can he make his villagers listen? He holds out this luminous stone that he's received. So it's a dramatic moment. He's weighing out whether or not he should sacrifice his own life or not. It's also at that moment that Ed Young kind of does a close-up with his work and really focuses in art-wise with this focus on Hailebu. So this picture really pleases me because I feel like it's two artists in different mediums approaching a moment, in a similar way, but though very differently.
So wonderful. Was this your first collaboration with an illustrator?
This is my first picture book.
Okay.
First one that's out in print. I actually sold a picture book called One Dog Canoe that some teachers have heard me talk about, since about 1997. That book is still coming out, but I think it won't be out until 2003.
Okay.
One of the first lessons that a writer learns is to be patient, 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 because not only do you first have to usually accumulate maybe hundreds of rejections before you find yourself published, but then once you get published or you have something accepted, it still takes so long sometimes before a book sees the light of day, and especially that's true with picture books.
Because of the collaboration with the illustrator and also the production, is that right?
Right. Well, I think artists sometimes aren't predictable, and on One Dog Canoe, this other book that's forthcoming, the first illustrator bailed off of the project after he was two-thirds done with the artwork for reasons that I still don't understand, and so we had to start the search all over for the right illustrator. And so eventually, it will be a book. I'm being patient.
That's great, and we'll all look for that book
Thanks.
to come out in 2003, you think?
I believe it's spring 2003.
Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. Now, Curse of a Winter Moon was a departure for you in a number of different ways. It's the first book, if I'm correct, that you've written that's set in a historical setting and an international setting as well. It's France, mid-16th century.
Right.
I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about the research challenges and opportunities that this book gave you.
Well, I knew it felt like I was jumping off a cliff because I was taking a huge risk. It wasn't Minnesota, it wasn't a contemporary Minnesota story, and that's what all 4 of my other middle grade young adult novels were. But I knew there was a good story there. My research had led me to learn that thousands of people had been burned at the stake back in 16th century France because they were believed to be werewolves or loups-garous. I came across that when I was writing Wolf Shadows and trying to understand people's fears and hatred toward wolves. When I came across that little fact, I thought, well, I didn't know that, and it's very troubling to me. And when something troubles me or I don't understand it, my way of dealing with being human, I think, is to write about it and get inside the shoes of a character. So this required going to France, actually spending a couple of weeks in Provence so that I could be there, use my 5 senses, try to take in that whole setting, visited a lot of little villages, and kind of created a composite village in my mind, a fictitious village called Veneer, and set the story there. The whole way through of writing the story, though, I thought, you know, what am I doing? Why do I think I can pull this off? In some ways, that Minnesota Book Award was a very nice validation that the story worked, at least for the people on that committee, and
right.
hopefully for a lot of other readers.
Well, and writing can be such a solitary act. What do those awards communicate to you?
I think they can be very arbitrary. So as a writer, I try not to give them any value in a sense and say, just do the work, just write the best story you can. And the awards or how well a book does is totally out of my control. And don't get too caught up in those things. On the other hand, winning the awards feels awfully good, and so that tells me that it does mean something to me. And I think what it means is that it's well, as a writer, you get published, and that's a validation of your work. It means an editor out there likes your work. But an award means beyond your editor, there are some well-read readers. It's literary-minded people who are looking at your work, comparing it to other work that I respect, and they're saying this has some value. So it is a nice validation. But I'll keep writing with or without the awards.
Great, that makes sense. The other thing, it seems to me, that awards bring is the chance for more children to enjoy your books and more young adults, and that's what a wonderful gift.
True.
To have that publicity, just so that more kids get to experience your writing.
Even doing an interview like this, you know, I tell myself this is a way to get the word out on your books, and I'm all about getting my books into the hands of young readers. And so I don't always feel like I want to be on stage myself, but I want my books to find their way into the hands of young readers.
It's great. The Curse of a Winter Moon, I think, will and has appealed to a number of kids because of both the historical setting and that fascination that a lot of children have with werewolves. But I also really love that in all of your books there's this thread of characters, their own personal experiences, pushing them up against some kind of political barrier or political upheaval. And that is very much the case of Curse of a Winter Moon. You're taking on religious persecution and literacy and superstition. And those are such large issues that are dealt with in a very tangible, hands-on way for kids to understand. And I guess what I'm wondering is how you've also in other books dealt with issues such as poaching and labor disputes, and I'm wondering how it seems that you don't see youth as living in a vacuum, a political vacuum. What do you see in a relationship between personal experience as for children and politics?
Lots of good comments that you just made, and I thank you for those. You know, it always comes down to getting inside the shoes of one character and saying, what if? In Curse of a Winter Moon, it was, well, what if you were in a family where someone was thought to be a werewolf or a loup-garou? And I thought, how would you deal with that? The more I researched it, the more I realized how complicated that environment was politically, religiously, and how thick the superstition was at that time. So I didn't have all the answers as I was writing the story. I didn't set out to say, this and this and this is how the story is going to happen. I didn't know how it would end, even though I try to end things on a hopeful note when I'm writing for younger readers. So I was exploring those issues in that time period, as complex as they were, through the eyes of one child, one young man of 12 years old. And I guess that's, again, the way I deal with life around me. In RIOT, which is a complicated story as well about the labor dispute that happened in International Falls, at first I thought, I can't write about this. This is going to be an adult book. But that was until I realized that kids were very much influenced by what was happening in our community when we had 600 men, angry men, storming through town, intent on causing damage to a place that housed non-union workers. Kids felt all that pressure. They felt it at home and they felt it at school. And so eventually I thought, you know, kids don't live in a vacuum. And to try to pretend that life is always rosy is really not being honest and true. So eventually I did find a character that I could write about and deal with those issues that I was struggling to understand, things that didn't have easy answers.
And it seems like that's such an important part of kids' own coming of age, is especially in RIOT, I think Brian is really struggling with the opinions of both of his parents and trying to find his own way in that struggle. What does he really believe about the labor dispute, and when is violence okay and when isn't it?
And those are the questions I was asking. You know, is there a right or a wrong side here? I knew what it was like to live through some of that violence, and I knew how disturbing it was to me as a peace-loving person. So again, it was my way of not trying to say, I know the answer to all of this before I'm going to write the story, but to explore it. And what I usually come away with is the truth is usually more in those gray areas than in the black and whites that we sometimes want to boil life down to.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And that's so much, and in the case of Brian and RIOT, and also Marius, or Marius?
I say Marius.
Marius in Curse of a Winter Moon, they're characters who they're very active characters, and yet at the same time they're weighing so many complex issues, and really you can feel Marius change over the course of Curse of a Winter Moon to really embrace his brother and put aside the superstitions of the villagers and really see that as outside himself. But at the beginning of the novel, that's not his perception at all.
Right. So you can't write a character. This is one of the things I learned along the way. You can't have a character who has all the answers and is a complete, whole, kind of perfect character. That I have to start with characters who are flawed, who are much more like I am, and who don't have all the answers. Then, you know, through the course of a story, you hope that they will grow some. They don't have to have all the answers, but they've made some changes that are important in their lives.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. I wonder if you would read from Curse of a Winter Moon for us for a few minutes.
Sure. And I think we'll show a clip of a reading that I did. Just recently there was a Minnesota Book Award celebration for the 2001 awards, and so this is from that reading, June 2001.
Wonderful.
Marius, she whispered, inviting me closer with a curve of her finger, Kiss your brother." In her arms, she cradled a tiny bundle. Barefooted, I jumped up. Strown rushes protected me from the icy wooden floor and came nose to nose with a sweet-smelling face, red as a ripe apple. The nose, eyes, and lips, everything were tiny and perfect. "Well, what's his name?" I asked. "Jean-Pierre," she said, her voice guarded. I smiled at my new brother and touched my forefinger to his nose. Madame Troubain pulled the blanket back from the baby until he squirmed and cried like a lamb. Only then did I remember it was Christmas Eve. Soon the villagers would follow the cart with the lamb to church to celebrate Christmas Day. "Poor one, this one," Madame Troubain said, gently caressing the baby's soft cheeks. "The mark is upon him." "What mark?" I studied my little brother's body, pink and wrinkled as a newborn mouse. I breathed in his scent, sweet as lavender fields in bloom, but saw no mark. She paused, chewed on her wrinkled lips, then spoke. "Why, the mark, the curse of the loup-garou, the werewolf, to be sure." She lifted her fingers to her forehead and made the sign of the cross over her chest. I stared at the baby. "Everyone knows that a child born on Christmas Eve is cursed," she said. "Only God knows what will become of this one." My stomach tightened. I inched back from the baby, the loup-garou. Only a short time past I had helped Madame Troubain bury a wolf's foot outside the village walls to keep away such evil. Suddenly I longed for my mother, her arms open, ready to draw me close. From somewhere outside, a rooster began to crow. "I want to see my mamma," I said, starting boldly for her bed in the shadowed corner. Madame Troubain's arm stopped me like a thick branch. She was short but solid. With her other arm, she held the baby close against her chest. She kissed the top of the baby's head, and then, through tears, she slowly shook her head. "Your mother is gone."
Maybe you could talk for a few minutes also about Stealing Thunder.
Sure. Stealing Thunder is, actually, it's the first book that I wrote that had a girl as the main character. Some of that was, I'm sure, because I grew up with this family of 7 brothers and 2 sisters, but a very male-dominated home. Somehow I could vicariously very easily step into the shoes of a boy character and give that character adventure. Also, the stories I was starting with, Moose Tracks, which dealt with poaching, and Wolf Shadows, and RIOT, all seemed to be stronger stories if I told them from a boy's point of view. So eventually the girls that I would meet would say, "Well, when are you going to do a character with a girl, or a book with a girl as the main character?" So Stealing Thunder was my answer to that one. The process for that was different for me. I found myself on my early drafts somewhat stuck. I had written my girl character, Libby, into a corner, almost literally, where she should have been heroic. She was very meek and very quiet, when she should have been standing up to the antagonist, Mr. Porter, who is abusing a horse that she cares about. My character was totally helpless. And I thought, what's going on? Why can't I write this story?
Interesting.
Well, I think I was getting in my own way. It was, as I wrote about a 12-year-old girl, I became much more, as the writer, that character that I was, which was a very shy girl that had a hard time speaking up, especially if there was conflict. So I had to do all kinds of journaling on the side to kind of work my way through what were my own personal limitations so that I could get back to just being this adult writer writing this story. So when I said characters need to change and grow in this story, I really had to work with Libby so that she started out as a character who had a lot of learning to do and speaking up to do. But by the end of the story, she is a heroic character, and she is somebody you want to root for. But it took me a while to figure that out and figure out what was going on.
That's so fascinating. Yeah. And that says so much about how our own stereotypes about how boys are and how girls are can get reinforced within our own minds, whether maybe from our own personal experiences in childhood.
Right. And I think as writers, you sit down and you think, oh, I have a story here, and it has nothing to do with me. And then when you finish writing it, or you get stuck and you have to look at why you're stuck, you can see that you're very much in that story, whether it's you as a child, whether it's you as an adult dealing with something in your life that as a writer you can't help but be in what you write about, even though you're trying to create completely different characters.
And it sounds like it felt even more that way because this was a girl character for you.
Right.
Even more reflecting of your childhood.
Right, it was. But I think having worked through that story, now one of the novels I'm working on now that will be out next spring, I think it's going to be called When Eagles Fall, but it's a girl on Rainy Lake up where I live, and she's lost with an injured eaglet. And she's very strong and very heroic, and I like this character immensely. And she has a lot to learn and a lot that she's working on, but I didn't have the same problems with her as I did with this character in Stealing Thunder. So maybe I'm learning and I'm growing.
That's exciting. So that should be out in spring of 2002?
I believe so.
Is that right?
Yes.
Great, how exciting. And what else are you working on now? What else can we expect?
A novel that'll be coming out through Pleasant Company, American Girl. They liked Curse of a Winter Moon, set in France, and they have a series coming out, should be sometime in 2002, called Girls of Many Lands. And they have dolls, about 9-inch dolls, and standalone novels with those dolls. And they asked me if I would do the one for the French doll, and it would be about a girl set at Versailles, France. So that required a more recent trip to France, 5 days of research at Versailles, which was really fun. And that's what I'm working on now. As I return home, I'll be thinking about that story. And then that other picture book, One Dog Canoe. So that's what's coming, and a lot of other ideas. I think I'll be writing for kids for quite a long time.
Oh, that's so exciting. Well, we'll be looking for your books. And also you mentioned that you'll go home and write, and I understand you have a very unusual writing environment when you do go home and write. Can you talk about where you write a little bit?
Well, the summers are more unusual because in the summer I try to take my laptop out onto a 46-foot renovated old houseboat. And this lake that I'm on, Rainy Lake, is a huge lake, and so you can get out on this lake and just explore all kinds of wilderness bays. So I take my laptop and whatever I'm doing for research, bring books along, and I get the quiet I need to get the work done. Plus I feel like I'm playing, and that's always good.
Sounds so marvelous.
Yeah,
writing on the surface of the water.
It is a good way to live. It's a good way to create, too. Then you leave phones behind and email and all of that stuff that tends to be distracting, and laundry and those things that come with having a family.
Mary, you've talked about not being much of a reader when you were a child. I'm wondering if you can, and yet now you write such wonderful books that I think appeal to kids that aren't necessarily big readers. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about how you did get interested in reading and writing. What were the things that spurred you on to do that, and then how it is that you approach writing in a way that will appeal to kids that are more reluctant readers?
You know, I know a good reader will read voraciously and read almost everything, but a reluctant reader like I was will pick and choose, and if the story doesn't hold their attention, they'll put it down and go back outside or go to a Nintendo game or whatever it is that might be more appealing. That's more of the reader I was growing up. Having grown up in this family with 10 kids, I had an instant hockey team outside on the lake. I had a gang to play tag in the swamp with. I really learned to love the outdoors. Had a horse when I was growing up, and so I did a lot of riding. There were a lot of books I would pick up, and I'd think, oh good, I'm ready to read a book. And then I would get into that book a few pages, maybe even halfway through it, and be bored to tears. And there were books that did work for me. I loved Charlotte's Web, and the things like Nancy Drew or Hardy Boys would be fast-paced, or way back when, Trixie Belden. Those kinds of books worked for me. But there are a lot of books that I thought, this isn't working for me. I must be a failure as a reader. I now think some of those books just weren't fast enough for me, for an active kind of a girl. So I really keep in mind the kind of kid I was when I'm sitting down to write a book, and I will spend a lot of time trying to get an opening chapter to move along, to make the reader ask questions as soon as possible that will make them think, what's going to happen next? So whether they're a good reader or a strong or a poorer reader, that they will, be motivated to turn those pages. I get a lot of feedback from kids that are kind of the falling through the cracks readers, who will pick up one of my books, and a teacher or a parent will tell me about this and say, they finished your book. It was like one of the first books they really finished, cover to cover, and then they went on to read another book and another book by another author. And if I can help one reluctant reader become a stronger reader that maybe is then a reader for life, beyond the writing that I do, I feel like that's one of my biggest callings. So I have a strong respect for those reluctant readers. They're not necessarily not good students, because I know I was a good student and I could read, but they need to be challenged mentally, and they need to have something that really holds their attention.
And they're a very discerning audience. If you've been successful with reluctant readers, then you really, like you said earlier, kids that read everything. It's not as much of a thrill that they loved your book, but
it's a great
child that's-
compliment. If they finish my book and they're not wild about reading, I'm
That's
very
huge.
much complimented and motivated to keep writing books that both challenge them but keep them reading.
Yeah, yeah. And I think part of what you do so well, too, is to keep the action really fast-paced, and yet you don't skimp on lofty ideas in the course of that action. You're still willing to take on issues that it seems like a lot of times there's a division between the books that are action-based and the ones that are for thinkers. And kids aren't like that. Kids that are active also are thinking about ramifications of their actions and the world around them. And I love that
They
you've
do.
found that combination.
Thank you very much. That's a nice compliment. I appreciate that. The other thing I try not to skimp on is just literary techniques, you know, trying to use language well, trying to weave in description, but sparingly so that it doesn't become pages and pages of lovely description and then lose a reader. So I kind of have to walk a fine line between that story that moves fast and writing that is literary and of some higher value.
Right, yeah. Now my last question is, what authors are you reading now in the children's and young adult genre? Who do you think is really exciting right now?
Well, I've loved reading Kate DiCamillo's new work because of Winn-Dixie. To see her get a Newbery honor for a book that I think is also very appealing to kids is great. I mean, I would love to get a Newbery Award someday, like Kate, that would recognize the quality of a work, and it would be a work that would also appeal to kids. So Kate's book is one that I really like a lot. Looking back in time, I'm not reading it right now, but one of the books that I should mention that influenced me to write for kids is Gary Paulson's Hatchet. That was one book that I thought, boy, here's an example of a Northwood story that I really like. It's got a lot going on. Maybe I have my own Northwood story. And so that influenced me in writing Moose Tracks and eventually Wolf Shadows as well.
Well, thank you, Mary Casanova, so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Lisa.
And thank you for joining us today, too. We've been talking with Mary Casanova, who is the author and recent award recipient of the Minnesota Book Award that she won for The Hunter and also for Curse of a Winter Moon. Thank you.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.